Thanksgiving morning, 1937. A hotel maid unlocks the door to room 820 of the Madison Hotel in New York City. As she walks in, she is taken aback by the sight of a fully clothed man sprawled on the floor next to the bed, a sheet loosely wrapped around the neck of his lifeless body. The police are called and then the press arrives. They're keen for information and the officer in charge dutifully responds. Accidental death is his announced verdict, but the next day the coroner says differently. Murder was the decided cause. The victim was Claude Kendall, known in New York literary circles as having been a book publisher of crime noir and pulp fiction novels, some of which the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald scorned upon, calling them slime. So why was he dead? Why was the police so quick to call it accidental when clearly he'd been murdered? And why has his killer never been caught? It's a tragedy that mirrors the storylines of his novels, a tale that at times crosses over into the dark side. So join me now as we piece together the mystery of Claude Kendall's final hours and discover why his case has remained unsolved. The police report. In a story published in the New York Daily News the day after Thanksgiving, Police Inspector Michael McDermott stated that he believed the death to be accidental, and the bruises seen on the victim's face were most likely caused by Mr. Kendall having drunkenly fallen out of his bed or against a piece of furniture. McDermott's dismissal of the case was quickly called into question, however, when the very next day, various New York newspapers carried a report on the victim's autopsy. The deceased, as stated by New York's Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, had died from the effects of a severe physical assault, that he had been beaten and kicked so savagely that he suffered multiple hemorrhages of the head, resulting in asphyxiation. Other newspaper reports were more shocking in their coverage and stated that Kendall's face had a black eye, that there were lacerations on his lips, a swollen jaw, hemorrhages of the head, body, and lacerations below the knee, the latter probably caused by kicking. These were clearly not the types of injuries that would be caused by falling out of bed. So why were the police so quick to call the death accidental? One writer, Howard Stevenson, believed that there was more to the case than what the police were admitting to, that they were perhaps chasing a ghost. Seeking the supernatural. Almost exactly 1 year after the murder, Stevenson wrote an article for a magazine in which he suggested that there was a connection between the murder of Claude Kendall and the death of a Mr. Charles Fort. The dark unknown, the weird, the terrible were meat and drink to Claude Kendall and Charles Fort, who spread a fateful aura over many who knew them. Then a ghostly doom tracked down these two men who dared too far. The magazine that chose to add to the pulp fiction narrative of this murder mystery was True Mystic Science, and in his article for the November 1938 issue, Stevenson presented very little evidence to support his dark theory, save that Kendall knew Fort. This fact was pretty well indisputable, as Fort was a writer and Kendall his publisher. Stevenson continues, was some unseen malevolent power resentful of the weird disclosures of the occult which these men, author and publisher, had dared to make. The disclosures that Stevenson is referencing rest largely in the realms of the author's imagination, though it's certainly true that Charles Fort was at least in part a researcher of the paranormal, and that he is credited with being the source of inspiration and arguably greatest influence for what was to become Fortean Times magazine. He also wasn't crazy. He was a respected writer, and his Fortean Society, created in 1931 during a meeting at the Savoy Plaza Hotel in New York, had on its board of founders some pretty notable names in the world of New York publishing. Firstly, there was Theodore Dreiser, whose 1900 book Sister Carrie has been called the greatest of all American urban novels. Also, there was Booth Tarkington, one of only 4 novelists to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature more than once. The former editor of Puck magazine was involved, Harry Leon, who helped popularize the term flapper and was also a member of the Algonquin Roundtable. Alexander Woolcott was also there. He was a drama critic and commentator for the New Yorker magazine. The point is, These were not the types of men who would want their names to be associated with mystic mumbo-jumbo. Claude Kendall's connection to this group was as a publisher. As well as looking after Fort's books, he also published those by Tiffany Thayer, and it was Thayer who brought this group together. It's Thayer rather than Kendall, if there were any fingers pointing towards those who might be happy to sidle up to the dark side. He was, after all, heavily connected to Fortean magazine. He was also investigated by the FBI, who said of him that he was the editor and dominant personality of the magazine. Also, and I again quote, that he was eccentric and uncommunicative. Sir Stevenson's article and conclusions, packaged under the headline of "Death Was Their Shadow," seems more like pulp fiction than anything ever published by Kendall. And if you pose the question, could anyone within this group have been responsible for his death? Yes, it's possible. But the police didn't see any reason to investigate the connection. The publisher. Although Stevenson was most likely looking to make a quick buck, writing that there was a supernatural basis to the murder, he may have been onto something in suggesting that Kendall had been delving into darker topics. As a publisher, he pursued titles that others dare not touch. Kendall's first published title was Uncle Sham by K.L. Gorber, whose dust jacket boasted that the book revealed the pools of nastiness, obscenity, and vice underlying the smug morality of the United States. He then went on to be the first publisher in the US to release Torture Garden by Octave Mirbeau, a book that touched on such interesting subject matter as that of a French politician's aide sent on a pseudo-scientific expedition to China, who visits a Cantonese prison, accompanied by the sadist and hysteric Clara, who delights in witnessing flayings, crucifixions, and numerous tortures, all done in beautifully laid-out gardens. She explains the beauty of torture to her companion and attains hysterical orgasm, passing out in exhaustion, only to begin again a few days later. He also published a book which had been banned in the author's home country of Australia and is considered to be one of the most bizarre thrillers to come out of the 1930s, Twisted Clay by Frank Wolford, which Kendall published in 1933, tells the story of Jean Deslignes, a precocious 14-year-old, a lesbian, a reader of psychology books, a murderess, and who is completely bonkers. As the list of risque titles that Kendall published grew, so did his wealth. Soon he was living in a luxurious Manhattan penthouse apartment, once formerly occupied by famed actress Ethel Barrymore, and he was enjoying life in all its excesses. These excesses were what ultimately led to the collapse of his publishing company in 1936. The overspending, the alcohol addiction, weren't helped by declining sales, and declaring bankruptcy, he was forced to accept a position as assistant editor with the publishing firm James T. White & Co. Gone was his penthouse apartment, replaced by a $7 a week room on the 8th floor of the Madison Hotel. So could someone have taken offense at his publishing resume? Or perhaps a crackpot who sought solace in snuffing out the life of a taboo book publisher? Again, yes, it's possible, but the police didn't see any reason to investigate this connection. Returning to the scene of the crime, there's a clue to the mystery in the connection between Kendall's increasing alcoholism and his taste for darker subject matter. But the final pieces of the puzzle only come together when you understand where he came from. Born in 1890 in the small-town life of Upper New York State, Claude Kendall aimed for bigger things. His first move was to work in an administrative position at the Mount Washington Hotel, one of the great turn-of-the-century grand resort hotels, which coincidentally inspired some of the interior design look for Stanley Kubrick's version of Stephen King's novel The Shining. At Mount Washington, Kendall, who was blonde, blue-eyed and highly presentable in dress clothes, met investment banker M.H. Rice, who hired Kendall as his personal secretary and took the young man with him to Europe. This was just the beginning of his adventures, as he then joined the Navy at the onset of World War I and continued his international traveling until returning to New York in the late 1920s to launch his publishing company. The impression that you're left with is of a well-traveled man who clearly enjoyed the company of other men. And then, returning to the scene of the crime, we have witnesses, the desk clerk, the lift operator, and those who had been drinking with him that evening. According to the latter, Kendall had attended a party on another floor of the hotel when, at around 1 a.m. of Thanksgiving morning, a very inebriated Mr. Kendall had been taken to his apartment by two friends. They stated to police that they took his shoes off but left him to sleep on his bed. The lift operator said that Mr. Kendall had then made his way down and left the hotel not long after this time, only to return at 3:30 a.m. with, and I quote, a slightly built, youthful white man. This man, it has been suggested, was a familiar figure in the Madison Square district where Kendall lived, and yet the police couldn't find him and didn't have a name. If it wasn't clear to you already, the suspect in Kendall's murder, the slightly built, youthful white man, was most likely picked up by Kendall in the early hours of Thanksgiving at a bar local to his hotel. Was Kendall gay? The suggestion is yes, and some excellent detective work done by the writer Curtis Evans, a link to whose article on Crimereads I'll leave below, goes a long way to support this theory. Though the police had eyewitnesses, their prime suspect disappeared. The suggestion being that either Kendall's surviving mother Clara may not have wanted the truth about her son's sexuality to be revealed, or that the police didn't want to pursue another gay bashing. The unmasking. Those are the facts behind this murder mystery. There seems little evidence to suggest that supernatural forces were at work, and the chances of this being some form of carefully planned hit unlikely given Kendall's late-night, spur-of-the-moment decision to go out and solicit dangerous company. What we're left staring into the face of is a family hiding a secret, and a police force avoiding scandal, neglective of its support for a gay community. This is one of the ugly truths of 1930s New York. The sad irony here being that this was the very subject touched on by the first book that Claude Kendall chose to publish, Uncle Sham, a cultural critique that perhaps he hoped might have permitted him and others like him to throw away their masks.